This is Democracy Now!
Last night, the United States brought the world's #1 terrorist leader to justice. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is dead. He was the founder and leader of ISIS, the most ruthless and violent terror organization anywhere in the world.
The world's most wanted man has died during a raid by U.S. Special Forces in northwestern Syria. We'll look at what the death of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi means for the future of ISIS and the Middle East. Then we go to Chile, where over 1 million people poured into the streets Friday amidst a massive ongoing uprising over economic inequality and crippling austerity. At least 18 people have died since the protests began.
I'm proud that everyone finally realized that the people above us governing are all a monopoly, and that there is no justice for people in any sense. This is discrimination from the poorest to the richest. And the truth is, I'm very happy because everyone realized this. I've always been waiting for a moment like this in my life.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The leader of ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, was reportedly killed in a U.S. Special Forces raid in northwestern Syria. Baghdadi had led the so-called Islamic State since 2010. At its peak, ISIS controlled a large swath of land across Syria and Iraq and maintained a force of tens of thousands of fighters recruited from more than 100 countries. The group also claimed responsibility for deadly attacks across 5 continents. Some analysts say al-Baghdadi was radicalized after he was jailed by U.S. forces in Iraq in 2004. He was held for 11 months, including reportedly at the notorious Abu Ghraib prison. On Sunday morning, President Trump announced al-Baghdadi's death in a televised address.
The thug who tried so hard to intimidate others spent his last moments in utter fear, in total panic and dread, terrified of the American forces bearing down on him.
During President Trump's speech, he invoked the names of U.S. journalists and aid workers who were killed by ISIS, although the vast majority of civilians killed by ISIS were Muslims, mostly in Iraq and Syria. Military leaders told the New York Times that al-Baghdadi's alleged killing by U.S. Special Forces Saturday came largely in spite of, not because of, President Trump's recent abrupt withdrawal of some U.S. troops from Syria. Al-Baghdadi reportedly set off his suicide vest. We'll have more on al-Baghdadi's alleged killing after headlines. California's governor has declared a state of emergency as climate change-fueled wildfires sweep across the state from Los Angeles to Northern California. Strong winds lashed the Bay Area over the weekend, spreading the fires across multiple counties, despite widespread mandatory PG&E blackouts intended to reduce the fire risk. The planned blackouts have left millions without power. Nearly 200,000 people are under evacuation orders, mainly in Sonoma County in Northern California. The San Francisco Chronicle reported the latest spate of fires have, quote, intensified fears that parts of California could become almost dangerous to inhabit. In Chile, over 1 million people poured into the streets Friday amidst a massive ongoing uprising over economic inequality and crippling austerity in the South American country. Chilean President Sebastián Piñera announced he will lift Chile's state of emergency tonight and begin a major cabinet reshuffle following the historic protests. At least 18 people have died. Hundreds more have been shot and wounded since protests erupted on October 19th amidst mounting reports of brutality and torture by Chilean authorities. The United Nations is sending a team to Chile to investigate allegations of human rights abuses against anti-government protesters. In Iraq, dozens of people were killed Friday and Saturday as Iraqis again took to the streets to protest corruption and lack of jobs. The major anti-government protests began earlier this month. Over 150 protesters were killed in the government's brutal crackdown against the first round of demonstrations. In Lebanon, tens of thousands of people gathered Sunday to form a human chain stretching north to south across Lebanon on the 11th day of nationwide anti-government protests. The 100-mile chain was intended to symbolize the protesters' unity and lack of sectarian divisions amidst the ongoing massive demonstrations against corruption, lack of jobs, and economic inequality. In Argentina, right-wing incumbent President Mauricio Macri resoundingly lost Sunday's national elections as voters cast their ballots for center-left opposition candidate Alberto Fernandez. The election was dominated by economic concerns. Nearly a third of Argentines are currently living in poverty after Macri imposed sweeping austerity measures and laid off tens of thousands of unionized public sector workers. The election was also a comeback for former President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, who ran as vice president. Britain will not be leaving the European Union Thursday as planned after European Union leaders agreed to extend the Brexit deadline until January 31st. Earlier this month, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson lost a critical vote aimed at fast-tracking a Brexit deal. Johnson had previously said he would rather be dead in a ditch than delay Brexit, Britain's departure from the European Union. In the United States, President Trump was booed and taunted with chants of "lock him up" at the fifth game of the World Series between the Washington Nationals and the Houston Astros Sunday night. The Astros beat the Nationals, giving them a 3-2 lead in the World Series playoffs. The Pentagon has awarded Microsoft a $10 billion technology contract to work on the military's cloud computing systems, beating out its competitors, including Amazon. President Trump reportedly told former Defense Secretary James Mattis to screw Amazon out of receiving the contract, according to a new book. President Trump has repeatedly attacked Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos, who also owns the Washington Post. Chicago Public Schools have canceled classes for the 8th consecutive school day as the Chicago Teachers Union continues to strike. Meanwhile, Chicago Public Schools and the SEIU Local 73, which represents 7,500 school support staff, have reached a tentative agreement on a new labor contract. The support staff union's bargaining team is still reviewing the final terms of the deal before officially ending their strike, but members of SEIU 73 say they'll be on the picket lines today in solidarity with the teachers. Earlier this month, more than 30,000 Chicago teachers and support staff went on strike to demand better pay and benefits, smaller class sizes, more nurses, counselors, social workers, and librarians. The historic strike brought the country's third-largest school system to a standstill. After a 40-day strike, a new 4-year deal between the United Auto Workers and General Motors was approved Friday. The contract was supported by 57% of the labor union. It includes an $11,000 bonus per member, annual raises, and more affordable health care. General Motors still plans to close 3 factories in the United States. About 48,000 United Auto Workers walked off the job over a month ago, making it the longest national strike at GM by United Auto Workers in nearly half a century. California Democratic Congressmember Katie Hill has announced she'll resign after admitting she had a relationship with a campaign aide before coming into office. The House Ethics Committee has also opened an investigation into allegations that Hill had a relationship with her legislative director. Hill has denied that relationship. The allegation surfaced after RedState.org and the Daily Mail published naked images of Katie Hill without her consent. Hill has accused her abusive husband of creating a, quote, smear campaign built around cyber exploitation and that he enlisted the help of, quote, hateful political operatives. In New York City, dozens of immigrants with deferred action for childhood arrivals and allies held a rally in Lower Manhattan Saturday to kick off a 16-day march from New York City to Washington, D.C., where the Supreme Court will hear arguments next month from 3 lawsuits demanding the Trump administration restore the Obama-era program that grants temporary work permits and deportation relief to nearly 1 million undocumented people who were brought to the United States as children. This is one of the marchers, Eliana Fernandez, a 31-year-old DACA recipient from Ecuador.
For me as a parent, the main reason why I'm here, I'm marching and I'm part of the movement is because of my kids. My children are everything. They're my biggest inspiration. I will do anything for them, including marching hundreds of miles. And I want for them to one day look at this day and remember or like feel proud and be like, you know, that was my mommy helping the immigrant community and helping herself. So that to me is like, you know, critical. A lot of us come from mixed status families. And I want to, like, you know, highlight that, right?
Eliana Fernandez is one of 200 people who will trek 230 miles to D.C. as they also hope to highlight the importance of long-term immigration relief to the 11 million undocumented people living in the U.S. The Supreme Court will hear arguments on the DACA case November 12th. The Trump administration announced its plans to kill the program in September of 2017. In Pittsburgh, residents gathered Sunday to mark the one-year anniversary since of the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue, one of the worst anti-Semitic attacks in U.S. history. On October 27th, a gunman armed with an AR-15 assault rifle opened fire inside the Squirrel Hill Synagogue, killing 11 worshipers. Just ahead of the shooting, the alleged gunman, Robert Bowers, posted a racist screed echoing President Trump's language about an invasion of immigrants. He faces a 63-count indictment and the death penalty. Former President Barack Obama praised longtime Congressman Elijah Cummings at his funeral Friday in Baltimore after his body lay in state in the U.S. Capitol. Cummings was the first African-American lawmaker to receive the honor. He spent decades championing the rights of African Americans and the poor, first as a civil rights activist, later as a Maryland state legislator, before being elected to represent his Baltimore district in the House of Representatives 13 times. This is former President Obama.
Elijah Cummings was a man of noble and good heart. His parents and his faith planted the seeds of hope and love and compassion and righteousness in that good soil of his. He has harvested all the crop that he could. But the Lord has now called Elijah home to give his humble, faithful servant rest. And it now falls on us to continue his work so that other young boys and girls in Baltimore, across Maryland, across the United States, and around the world might too have a chance to grow and to flourish.
That was President Obama speaking Friday in Baltimore at the funeral of the late Congressmember Elijah Cummings. He died earlier this month at the age of 68. And longtime Michigan Congressmember John Conyers has died at the age of 90. Conyers was the longest-serving African-American in the history of the U.S. Congress. Throughout his more than 5 decades as a U.S. Congressmember, he co-sponsored the original Voting Rights Act of 1965. He helped found the Congressional Black Caucus. He opposed the Vietnam War, the Persian Gulf War, the 2003 invasion of Iraq. He also pushed for Medicare for all for decades and legislation to study reparations for slavery. He spent 15 years fighting to make Martin Luther King Day a national holiday. In 2017, Conyers resigned from Congress after multiple women accused him of sexually harassing or groping them. He denied the charges. This is Congressmember Conyers speaking on Democracy Now! In 2010 about the Out of Afghanistan caucus, a group of lawmakers who are fighting against the escalation of the U.S. war in Afghanistan.
It's never been clear to me that through war we can bring peace, especially when we're the invaders, we're the ones using drones, we're causing civilian deaths to many people who would otherwise be more friendly to us. We're creating the terrorists. This is not being lost on most of the people in the country now.
That was longtime Michigan Congressmember John Conyers, Jr. speaking on Democracy Now! In 2010. He died Sunday at his home in Detroit at the age of 90. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We turn now to the reported death of ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. On Sunday, President Trump announced al-Baghdadi had blown himself up along with 3 of his children after U.S. Special Operations Forces raided a compound in northwestern Syria where he'd been hiding. Baghdadi had led the so-called Islamic State since 2010. In 2014, he proclaimed the creation of the Islamic Islamic Caliphate during a speech in Mosul. At its peak, ISIS controlled a large swath of land across Syria and Iraq and maintained a force of tens of thousands of fighters who carried out mass killings, rape, beheadings, and torture. The group also claimed responsibility for deadly attacks across 5 continents. The vast majority of civilians killed by ISIS were Muslims, mostly in Iraq and Syria. Some analysts say al-Baghdadi was radicalized after he was jailed by U.S. forces in Iraq in 2004. He was held for 11 months, including reportedly at the notorious Abu Ghraib prison. On Sunday morning, President Trump announced al-Baghdadi's death in a televised address.
No personnel were lost in the operation, while a large number of Baghdadi's fighters and companions were killed with him. He died after running into a dead-end tunnel, whimpering and crying and screaming all the way. The compound had been cleared by this time, with people either surrendering or being shot and killed. 11 young children were moved out of the house and are uninjured. The only ones remaining were Baghdadi in the tunnel, and he had dragged 3 of his young children with him. They were led to certain death. He reached the end of the tunnel as our dogs chased him down. He ignited his vest, killing himself and the 3 children. His body was mutilated by the blast. The tunnel had caved in on it in addition. But test results gave certain, immediate, and totally positive identification. It was him. The thug who tried so hard to intimidate others spent his last moments in utter fear, in total panic and dread, terrified of the American forces bearing down on him.
The raid began early Sunday when 8 U.S. military helicopters flew from a base near Erbil, Iraq, to northwestern Syria over airspace controlled by Syria and Russia. The New York Times reports Syrian and Iraqi Kurds had provided more intelligence for the raid than any single country. The raid comes just weeks after President Trump abandoned his support for the Kurds in northern Syria, greenlighting Turkey's recent invasion. The U.S. named the operation targeting al-Baghdadi after Kayla Mueller, the American aid worker who was taken hostage by ISIS after she crossed the Turkish border into Syria to visit a hospital in 2013. She died in 2015, but her body was never found. She was raped by al-Baghdadi himself. We're joined now by 3 guests. In London, Emma Beals is with us, award-winning investigative journalist researcher who has covered the Syrian conflict since 2012, editor of Syrian Context. In Ann Arbor, Michigan, Juan Cole, professor of history at University of Michigan. His blog Informed Comment is online at juancole.com. He's the author of many books, including Muhammad, Prophet of Peace Amid the Clash of Empires and Engaging the Muslim World. And in Boston, Rami Khoury, senior public policy fellow and journalist in residence at the American University of Beirut. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Middle East Initiative and a columnist for The New Arab. Juan Cole, let's begin with you. Your response to the death of al-Baghdadi.
Well, I think it should be remembered that the organization he led, ISIL, developed originally as Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia and arose in reaction to the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq. And so the same kinetic U.S. military that in some ways inadvertently created ISIL has now ended one of its leaders. It certainly hasn't destroyed the organization or the impulse that lies behind it. And I think if anybody thinks that kinetic military operations in this part of the world are going to solve all the problems, they're sadly mistaken.
and the significance of al-Baghdadi. I mean, while President Trump talked about the killing of the U.S. aid workers and journalists, the rape of Kayla Mueller, who also died in a bombing in Syria where she had been held captive, the fact is that, and probably these journalists and aid workers would have been the first to point this out, ISIS had killed thousands of Muslims.
Yes, well, ISIL developed a strategy. It's a terrorist strategy as a small group that wanted to emerge as a state of what it called acting like beasts. And it was quite deliberate to terrorize people all around it into submission, to convince the enemy that they were invulnerable because they would act in such a beastly and violent and berserk way. And in many ways it worked. They intimidated very large numbers of people at their height, millions, into submission. Iraqi soldiers who fought them talked about the horror of going into alleyways and facing men who would jump down from roofs onto them with suicide bomb belts and detonate them. It wasn't hand-to-hand combat, it was hand-to-bomb combat. And so this policy of beastliness was also a media strategy to attract followers. One of the advantages that they sought was to get highly trained former soldiers from Europe who might join them, and their policies were designed to attract people with violent tendencies who had that training. This strategy, however, has severe drawbacks in that over time, especially if you were trying to run a state, it would make you extremely unpopular, not only with your own population, but with all of the neighbors. And it is an essential contradiction in ISIL strategy that they tried to continue to operate as a terrorist organization once they had a known address. And the only way terrorism can be at all successful is if they can't find you. But if you have a capital, then you're doomed.
And finally, can you tell us, Juan Cole, about the history of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi? In a nutshell, how he rose to power, what his background was, his captivity in being in U.S. captivity back during the beginning of the Iraq War, the U.S. invasion of Iraq.
Sure. Well, al-Baghdadi was not, as he's being advertised, an Islamic scholar. He barely passed high school. He was shunted off to what was called the Islamic University of Baghdad, which was a low-level institution in Ba'athist Iraq. He seems to have preached some sermons at a local mosque as a kind of volunteer. And then he got arrested in 2004 along with some associates. The U.S. military in Iraq would arrest large numbers of people if they were simply in the vicinity of a bombing or an act of resistance against the U.S. occupation. At any one time, they had 25,000 Iraqis, mostly Sunni Arabs, in captivity. These prisons served as an opportunity, however, for some Iraqi oppositionists to network with others, and al-Baghdadi seems to have met some of the people who formed ISIL with him there in U.S. captivity. An organization arose to oppose the U.S. occupation called Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia. Its leader was killed, Abu Musab Zarqawi, in 2006. Baghdadi joined that organization. In 2010, he emerged as the leader of it. He did innovate in the sense that he thought al-Qaeda was wrong to just engage in terrorism in hopes of weakening the state for an eventual revolution. He thought there was an opportunity, because U.S. rule in Iraq was so weak and it had destroyed the state, to actually take and hold territory under the Americans' nose. And that's what he started to do. And that was all along what distinguished his tactics is that he thought there's an opportunity here to create state structures. And in 2014, when the organization took 40% of Iraq and made Mosul its Iraqi center of operations, he declared himself a caliph, a kind of Muslim pope, much to the derision of most of the Muslim world, but it did attract, again, some violent activists.
Was he held by U.S. forces? Was he imprisoned by the U.S., either at Abu Ghraib or other places?
Well, he was in prison, as far as we know, at the U.S. hands in 2004 for many months. That certainly was one of the origins of his radicalization, although the U.S. occupation of Iraq was radicalizing enough. People forget now 4 million Iraqis out of 26 million at the time were displaced from their homes and made homeless, not directly necessarily by the U.S. occupation, but as a result of it. Hundreds of thousands died. Sunni Arabs were suddenly viewed with suspicion by the new Shiite-led government. Many had worked for the Ba'ath government of Saddam Hussein, were fired from their jobs. 100,000 were fired from state jobs. Massive unemployment, as much as 75% unemployment developed in Sunni Arab areas. And so this was an apocalyptic event for the Sunni Arabs of Iraq, and over time radicalized millions of them. Because I think the U.S. destroyed the secular socialist alternative in Iraq quite deliberately, one of the few avenues for their activism that was left was a hyper-Sunni fundamentalism, which was extremely rabid in its hatred of foreigners and Shiites. But this is a night and day transformation of Sunni Arab Iraq, which had, as I said, largely been secular-minded and even refused Islam as the state religion.
We're going to go to break, then come back to this discussion. We're speaking to Professor Juan Cole at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. We'll bring in Rami Khoury, who is at Harvard Kennedy School, and Emma Beals, award-winning investigative journalist who's currently in London. Stay with us. Music by Nasir Shama. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we discuss the death of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. We go to President Trump making the announcement on Sunday.
Yeah, we know the successors, and we've already got them in our sights, and we'll tell you that right now, but we know the successors. Hamza bin Laden was a big thing, but this is the biggest there is. This is the worst ever. Osama bin Laden was very big, but Osama bin Laden became big with the World Trade Center. This is a man who built a whole, as he would like to call it, a country, a caliphate, and was trying to do it again.
So that's President Trump making the announcement about the death of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi on Sunday morning. Apparently, he briefed Russia before he briefed the U.S. congressional leaders, particularly the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi. Our guests are Juan Cole of University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, Emma Beals, award-winning journalist who's covered Syria for years, and Rami Khoury of the Harvard Kennedy School. Rami, if you could respond to the news of the death of Abu al-Baghdadi and the significance of this, what this means, and what exactly President Trump said yesterday?
The important thing to recognize is the longer trajectory of these kinds of radical terrorist inhuman movements across the Arab world, but also in other parts of the world, in Asia and other places in Africa. But the core of these movements has been in the Arab region, and it tells us that there really is a two-headed problem here. One is the nature of these small groups like Al-Qaeda, like ISIS, and a few others that create formal groups, and they carry out terrorist acts. And ISIS went so far as to create a so-called state that didn't last very long. But the other part of this, which is far more important, and which the United States and Arab countries and European countries and Russia and virtually everybody in the world seems unwilling or unable to acknowledge, is that these groups are symptomatic of a much deeper structural set of stresses, inequities, unmet needs, and distortions in the fabric of much of the Arab world, not all of it, but much of it, that creates hundreds of millions, literally several 100 million Arab men and women and families that are desperate to live a normal life. And a small number of them break off and go and join these groups, a very small number. But the biggest number of Arabs who are in this situation are out on the streets. You see them today. Turn on your TV or check your news feeds. Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, Morocco, Sudan, Algeria, all across the Arab world, you've got literally millions of people demonstrating, and this is the deeper problem. So Al-Qaeda and ISIS are symptomatic of deeper problems, and if those deeper problems are not addressed by the Arab countries themselves, the military-led leaderships predominantly, or by the foreign powers that have supported these autocratic Arab leaderships for probably 4 or 5 decades now, if those issues are not addressed, we will just keep getting these kinds of movements emerging over and over. And remember, it started in the 30s and 40s with the predominantly nonviolent Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and parts of the Levant. And a few of them became violent later on. They assassinated Sadat, they did other things. But a nonviolent movement started, and then you had Hamas and Hezbollah that emerged as religious-led political resistance movements, mostly responding to the Israeli occupation of Arab lands. They became militarily very successful and did carry out some terrorism acts here and there, but for the most part they were resistance movements. And after that you got Al-Qaeda, and then you got ISIS, and you got dozens and dozens of these movements in Syria. So you can see the historical progression, and this is really the big issue. So killing Baghdadi is an important short-term setback to a group that anticipated this would happen, clearly has restructured its organizational system and its operational methods so that it would not be destroyed when the leader was killed. And they expected this, and of course you'll still get ISIS trying to carry out some terror and military violent attacks here and there. But the bigger problem is that the overwhelming majority of people who are suffering in the Arab world are suffering because of the authoritarian regimes they live under, the social and economic and political inequities, the continuing ripple effects of 100 years of the Arab-Israeli conflict with continued Israeli colonization of Arab lands, and the continued support of big powers around the world to this status quo, most recently exhibited in U.S. and British and French active involvement in the war in Yemen, the war in Libya, supporting Sisi in Egypt, and any other situation you want to look at in the Middle East. So that's the bigger picture. And the United States is not understanding it. Nor are most of the Arab leaderships or foreign leaderships, and this is a problem because it means we're going to continue on this trajectory with more radicalization, more violence, and more suffering, and most of the suffering is done by Arabs and Muslims.
Emma Beals, on Sunday you tweeted, quote, Baghdadi's death will be fodder for U.S. news cycle in coming days. It's important to remember the majority of ISIS victims are in Syria and Iraq. This is important for them. Also, Idlib is now probably in a more perilous situation than before, in particular the civilians, unquote. Baghdadi had reportedly been hiding out in Idlib, Syria's last major opposition-held enclave. Talk about what you fear will happen there now.
So the large fear for Idlib, which is the last of the so-called de-escalation areas, which is sort of part of the Astana agreement between Iran, Russia and Turkey, where they would sort of reduce hostilities in those areas. But what we've seen is the other three de-escalation areas have been subject to large military campaigns and return to government of Syria control. And that's probably going to happen in Idlib in some kind of a way. And you've seen a government in Russia campaign against Idlib over the last few months, and there's been a ceasefire just recently. Now, the biggest argument that they have for conducting this operation in Idlib is the presence of HTS, which is a former al-Qaeda affiliate and is designated under the Security Council resolutions about the area as being regarded as terrorists by everybody, so from the US through to the government of Syria and everybody in between. And the problem there is basically that because of the presence of HTS in this area, 3 million civilians who live there, many of whom have been displaced from other areas of Syria because of the conflict and have been displaced up to 10 times, are now very vulnerable to this large military campaign. And at the moment, they have nowhere to go. The border to Turkey is closed. They're not able to flee if that campaign restarts. And so the real fear is that because Baghdadi was found in Idlib to be hiding out in that area, which comes as something of a surprise because the al-Qaeda affiliates and former al-Qaeda affiliates have been very hostile to ISIS historically. The fear is that Idlib becomes viewed solely through a counter-terror lens, which there has been a tendency to do of late anyway. But if it is seen solely through a counter-terror lens, you have 3 million civilians who are very desperate, who have been displaced multiple times throughout an extended conflict, who are in a desperate humanitarian situation, and who may now find themselves even more at risk of being attacked because of this sort of terror lens that people are looking at Idlib through. Of course, it's very important to deal with those groups, be they ISIS or al-Qaeda affiliates or former al-Qaeda affiliates. However, it's important to also view it as a civilian protection issue when you're talking about those large numbers of civilians living there who do have nowhere else to go. And that's the real fear that I sort of immediately had for the people of Idlib when I heard the news.
Now, Emma, you worked hard to try to have some of these journalists released. You knew them. And, of course, Kayla Mueller, who was raped by al-Baghdadi himself, she would be the first to point out as a humanitarian aid worker, as a peace activist, that so many more Muslims had been killed under ISIS, you know, the Yazidi women raped by ISIS. If you could talk about your efforts and who you knew who died.
Well, we're a close community, those of us that work in these kind of areas. So we knew of or knew everybody that was detained, not just myself, but so many of my colleagues that were working in the area were personally affected by this. And we obviously, when our colleagues were taken, did everything that we could within the sort of limited capacities that we had as individuals to try to help to have them released. And that was ultimately kind of unsuccessful. But I think what's important to remember, though, is that justice for those American hostages comes in several different ways. So obviously, Baghdadi's death is hugely important as a sort of very big symbolic issue. He was the person in charge, you know, when they were held and murdered. He also did just appalling things to all of the people living in the areas that he was in control of in both Syria and Iraq. But even if you're just looking at the Western hostages themselves, there are 2 of the people from the group known as the Beatles who took part in the detention and killing of those
Explain who you mean by
who
the
have
quote
been
Beatles.
detained. So the group of ISIS fighters who were the ones who detained and then were part of killing the Western hostages, two of them they were nicknamed the Beatles by the hostages themselves, and that's kind of how they've become known in the press. So two of them, so one of them, Jihadi John, so-called Jihadi John, was killed in a drone strike in 2015, and two of them have been detained in northeastern Syria for over 2 years now, and there's been an absolute quagmire in terms of trying to get them to trial, in terms of trying to see real justice done by bringing them to the UK or to the US to stand trial with evidence for the things that they have done. So in terms of invoking the names of those hostages in the speech that Trump gave, yes, there's obviously, particularly with Kayla, a direct link to Baghdadi and to the others because he was in control at the time, but it's important to remember that justice isn't just about a military activity. It's also about making sure that the rule of law, bringing ISIS fighters to justice for those Western hostages and also for the regional communities that were affected by them is hugely important as well.
I wanted to go back to President Trump. A lot of clips were taken just from the very first part of the announcement he made on Sunday morning. But he then moved on, rambling wildly.
These people are very smart. They're not into the use of cell phones anymore. They're very technically brilliant. They use the internet better than almost anybody in the world, perhaps other than Donald Trump. But they use the internet incredibly well. And what they've done with the internet through recruiting and everything, and that's why he died like a dog. He died like a coward. He was whimpering, screaming, and crying.
Juan Cole, President Trump's comments, from the dogs to the internet.
Well, Trump is an extremely disturbing leader in the sense that he basically gave us a snuff film, a film about somebody's violent death as a sort of entertainment, I think. And one of the ironies is that ISIL pioneered on the internet what's called stochastic terrorism. Most terrorism is conducted by organized cells with a certain amount of command and control. One of the things that ISIL did as part of its policy of beastliness was to call upon people to undertake violent actions as a destabilizing attempt. And I think it appealed to people on the internet who were already angry and unstable, often mentally ill, and they would go out and commit violence, and then would attribute it to ISIL, even though ISIL knew nothing about it. It was just off of a Twitter or Facebook meme. In many ways, although not with the same systematic effect, Trump also is responsible for a certain amount of stochastic terrorism. The El Paso shooter who drove 10 hours to kill Latino Americans was, by his own admission, at least somewhat inspired by memes coming out of the Trump administration. We saw this in other attempted attacks on mosques in the United States. And of
course, invoking Hispanic invaders was a year ago at the Pittsburgh synagogue where 11 Jewish worshipers were killed.
Yes, Trump has adopted, and people around him have used this language of replacement, which is a far-right conspiracy theory that the American Jewish community wants to bring in immigrants to replace white people, and so made the American Jews a target. It's, of course, a monstrous lie. But these kinds of internet memes, which ISIL in some ways pioneered as sources of violence, have now been taken up by the American far right, which is in itself a kind of less organized but still very deadly form of ISIS-like activity.
Finally, I wanted to go to Rami Khouri. You're at Harvard Kennedy School, but you generally are in Lebanon. Talk about the significance of the protests that are taking place there, and now the reactivated protests in Iraq, where more than 150 Iraqis were killed, but the massive number of people, the human chain across Lebanon that was formed this weekend.
Yes, I think to see these protests in their proper historical and human context, you have to see them as being the latest phase of populist street demonstrations, activism using the law, activism using elections, petitioning leaders, boycotting groups that are abusing you, doing all kinds of things that Arab men and women and groups, civil society groups, have done for the last about 45 years. You could really trace the beginning of this movement of citizen activism for a more decent life, for social justice, for equity, for opportunity, for accountability, for participation, for voice, for a decent life. That's all people are asking for. They're not asking for power or wealth or revenge. They just want to live normal lives, which they haven't been able to do in recent years, with about 66% of all Arabs now well documented by many surveys, both Arab and international. About 66, about 2 out of every 3 Arabs is poor and vulnerable. And they're marginalized politically, and they don't have any rights, and they often don't even have any voice. If you speak out now in places like the United Arab Emirates or Egypt or other places, you're indicted or sent to jail or something. So this is a long process that started 30, 40 years ago, never got anywhere because the autocratic, authoritarian power structure was so strong and could beat back any kind of rebellion. But now people have reached the limit, and you see in Jordan, and Lebanon, and Iraq, Sudan, Algeria, other places, you see people just, they can't put up with it anymore. They can't feed their children in many cases. They don't know what to do when they have 4 or 5 children. None of them have jobs. None of them are going to have any decent income. So this is a process of public demonstrations representing people who've reached the limit of their endurance, and they're being treated by their own power structure. Forget about Israel, forget about the U.S., forget about Russia, Iran, all these other people who are militarily and politically being involved in the Middle East and abusing people. It's just the internal disdain with which governments treat their own people. That's the driving force. And in Lebanon, people have tried this several times before, but never has it reached the intensity, the depth, the breadth, and the sophistication of the demonstrations we see today, where people are basically sitting in the streets, playing chess, playing music, cooking food, demanding that the power structure that has demeaned them and has not served them for the last 30, 40 years, this whole power structure be changed. And that's what's so interesting now. We're not talking about people asking, like they did 20, 30, 40 years ago in demonstrations, to lower the price of milk or take away this extra tax on gasoline. They're asking for a complete overhaul of the governance system so that it reflects the fact that sovereignty is vested in the citizen. And the citizen is the driver of public policy. What you have in Lebanon and most Arab countries is a political elite. In Lebanon, it's sectarian-based. So you have an oligarchy of religious and ethnic leaders who have been there for 30, 40 years. Fathers pass it on to their sons. And in other countries, it's not so sectarian-based. It's based on other mechanisms. But people are simply fed up in all of these countries. They don't have strong ideas about exactly how to set up the government, but they're articulating principles that are very dear to them and alien to their real life, which is justice, opportunity, equality, decency, dignity, and a normal life. That's all they're asking for, a normal life. So that's how we should see these demonstrations.
I want to thank you so much for being with us.
They're nonviolent, which is very important. The Sudan example is probably the most interesting one.
We're going to have to leave it there as we have to move on to other protests that are taking place right now in Chile. Rami Khouri, Senior Public Policy Fellow and Journalist in Residence at American University in Beirut, non-resident Senior Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School. Juan Cole, Professor of History at University of Michigan. His blog Informed Comment is at juancole.com. And Emma Beals, award-winning investigative journalist who is editor of Syria in Context, speaking to us from London. When we come back, we go to Chile, and more than 1 million people poured into the streets this weekend.
sientan la flor con genocidio y napalm. La luna es una explosión que funde todo el clamor, el derecho.
The Right to Live in Peace by the legendary Chilean folk musician Victor Jara. Thousands of demonstrators in Santiago gathered Friday and sang this song in unison. Victor Jara's music has become a soundtrack of the current movement. He was murdered just after September 11, 1973, when the dictator Augusto Pinochet rose to power in a U.S.-backed coup. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman as we turn to Chile, where President Sebastián Piñera has announced a major reshuffling in his cabinet after more than 1 million people flooded the streets Friday in massive peaceful demonstrations over inequality, high cost of living, and privatization. The protests drew more than 5% of Chile's population, followed days of widespread civil unrest and a violent police and military crackdown across Chile. On Saturday, Piñera also vowed to ease the military-imposed curfew. At least 18 people have died. Hundreds more have been shot and wounded since protests erupted October 19th amid mounting reports of brutality and torture by Chilean authorities. The protests in Chile began in response to a subway fare hike, have grown into a mass uprising against neoliberalism and demands of political reform. Piñera canceled the fee increase, but protests have continued. Chile is one of the richest countries in Latin America, but also one of the most unequal. For more, we're joined here in New York by Professor Macarena Gómez-Barras. She's founder and director of the Global South Center and chairperson of social science and cultural studies at the Pratt Institute. Author of a number of books, including Where Memory Dwells, Culture and State Violence in Chile. Her mother worked in the Allende government that was overthrown by the Pinochet regime. Macarena came to the U.S. just after the 1973 coup. And we're joined in Santiago, Chile, via Democracy Now! Video stream by Alondra Carrillo Vidal, a spokeswoman for Chile's largest feminist advocacy group, Coordinadora Feminista 8M. The group organized the largest feminist mobilization since the end of Pinochet's dictatorship. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! And we're going to begin with Alondra in Santiago. Can you explain what happened this weekend, the massive protests that took place, and what you're demanding?
Yes, I can try to explain, because I think it's really not possible right now. But I can try. Yes, what we saw Friday was the largest mobilization since the end of the dictatorship. Maybe it's similar in size as the mobilizations to end the dictatorship of Pinochet. And it's this inorganic tendency of people to occupy the streets and to protest in the streets. But it doesn't really have any demand. It doesn't really have any list of demands. It's almost about everything. It's about life itself, the way it's organized in Chile, the way it's gotten worse with the years, and the way that people fear it's going to be even worse in the future. Because the political measures that have been taken by all governments, not just Piñera, but the governments that came before of the Concertación y Nueva Mayoría, the center-left governments, have also deepened these political measures that are neoliberal political measures that have made the conditions of life really precarious for the majority in Chile. And also that are sustained in structural violence, like violence against women, against sexual dissidents, against migrants, and against the indigenous people. And all of that violence is part of day-to-day life in Chile. I believe that's why we have not got one demand or several demands, but a horizon for life to change deeply in Chile.
And can you talk about the significance of Piñera dismissing his whole cabinet to form a new one? Does that matter to you and to the protesters at this point?
No, we're asking him to leave. People want to overthrow this government because they are responsible not only for the political measures that have made life precarious in the last years, but also he's responsible politically for the rapes, the sexual political violence that has been taken by the military and the police. He's responsible for the disappearance and murders of people in the last week. So I think he's taken a desperate measure with this, asking all his ministers to leave. But it's a desperate measure that will not calm people, because that's not what we want. We don't want this government to reorganize itself. We want them gone.
Professor Macarena Gómez-Barros, you have been involved in the struggle in Chile back through your family, working in the Allende government. You then fled to this country after Pinochet rose to power. One of the chants and the protests, neoliberalism began in Chile, it will die in Chile. The significance of this?
This is a powerful statement, and I think one of the things it says, Amy, is the continuities that have happened since the Pinochet dictatorship. As you may know, Chile was the birthplace of neoliberalism in many ways, and structural adjustment and the link to the Washington Consensus was strong there. And there's been ongoing pressure on people creating precarious conditions for many, many years. And what is important to say here is that the Pinochet Constitution of 1979 that was revised during the dictatorship is still in place. So people are still living with the kind of legal apparatus that was put in place there and the ongoing security apparatus. There's much to be said about what's currently going on in Chile. And one thing that has not been documented in the news very directly is the connection with the indigenous, anti-indigenous legislation and the kind of terrorism, the discussion of terrorism and the discourses of terrorism that have been used against Mapuche, Pehuenche, Huiliche peoples in the southern territories. And this has been going on for the last 30 years, since the 1990s. We see this transference of what's happening in the deep south now to Santiago and other places. And this is a really important discussion because it has served as a lab for the security apparatus. And so the human rights violations, the kinds of tortures, the disappearances, they have continuity with what happened before, but it's also continuity with what's been going on much more recently in indigenous Chile.
Alondra, do you see this only growing? And talk about the feminist leadership of this mass movement. You have 5% of the entire population coming out this weekend.
Yes, I don't know if it's been a leadership, but it's been an important participation in this, because I say it's not a leadership because this has no leadership at all, I believe. People are organizing from below. And what we have done as feminists is we're saying we're encouraging people to organize local assemblies to take care of many things. One of them is care, collective care of children and the elderly, local assemblies to take care of food and sustainment, and also to open a discussion about what we want for the future and what we want as a country. What we have done in March 8th with several hundreds of thousands of women in the streets is to put forward a political program to confront many aspects of life. That has been a horizon of the feminist movement in the last year.
Alondra, we're going to go to part 2 of our discussion in a moment, and we're going to post it online at DemocracyNow.org. Alondra Carrillo Vidal speaking to us from Santiago, Chile, of the Coordinadora Feminista 8M. And here, Pratt University professor Macarena Gómez-Barros will continue the discussion both in English and in Spanish at DemocracyNow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.